All right, welcome back to another episode of the Always Adaptive podcast. I'm your host, Randall James. This is episode number 13, going strong, no signs of slowing down. I want to wade myself into a debate today. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the ketogenic diet and the carnivore diet. And there's this debate that the ketogenic diet is as good, if not superior, to carbohydrate-rich diets for endurance style exercises. So this is kind of where the debate began, is in running communities and cycling communities and all that stuff, because there's been a rise of athletes that predominantly use ketogenic diets or carnivore diets, and they're having success on it. Their performance doesn't see a decrease. In fact, some of these people are really high performers. They do really well on these styles of diets. But I think there's a couple things missing from the debate, and that's why I want to sort of wade myself through it and impose my lens on this, because there's the thing that's happening is that people aren't viewing it through the lens of health. And if they are, their view of what healthy means is lacking a couple components. So just to be clear in the beginning here, I support the ketogenic and carnivore diets. I think there are a lot of people that have a lot of great success for so many different applications, whether that's them trying to lose fat or whether that's just them trying to get healthy in the first place. Some people have really severe chronic conditions and they use the ketogenic diet or the carnivore diet to help them get back to baseline. I think they're both very useful as elimination style diets, where you eliminate carbohydrates out of your diet, you eliminate all the junk, and you just have a high fat or a high animal protein diet. And then, over time, you start to slowly reintroduce things. And so I just wanted to get that out of the way first before people start coming after me, because I can already hear people knocking at the door right now. I also think it's great for endurance sports, especially because endurance sports require fat oxidation as one of the major fuel components. So where I think it misses the mark is on maximal muscle maintenance and building maximal strength and power output. This is important to me because, admittedly, this is sort of my bias, where I view all of this through the lens of health, as I said. And as we age, we lose a tremendous amount of muscle. And most of those muscle fiber types are fast twitch muscle fibers. So along with that, we also lose our ability to move quickly. We lose speed. So health is a very comprehensive thing. It's not just this one thing or that one thing. It includes a whole bunch of different metrics that we have to take into account. So with the slowing down comes falls. What's one of the major causes of death for people over the age of 65 is falls. So that's a very big deal to me. VO2 max is also a very important factor, but the trick is, for me, can you increase VO2 max, improve your endurance and strength, and improve your power while not losing lean tissue and potentially even building lean tissue? And for that, all of that, this is where I think the ketogenic diet misses the mark. The carnivore diet, admittedly, there is not that much data out there on it. So I'm going to talk about one meta-analysis, but this meta-analysis, please take it with a grain of salt. And, I am not ready to die on this hill. So if you are listening or watching out there and you know a study that refutes everything that I'm about to talk about, please put it in the comments. I love reading studies and I love a good discussion. I'm not a zealot. This is just me wading through what I could find, some of the research, which admittedly, this is not a very deep dive. I'm going to talk about 4 different studies, 3 for keto and 1 for carnivore, because again, carnivore is limited. But yeah, I think at least talking about the muscle mass point is important, especially in runner groups, because runners specifically will only talk about performance. Like, oh, well, look at this guy. He's, running this marathon at this pace, blah, 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 or he's running this ultra marathon or this half marathon. And they don't ever talk about muscle strength and power, which are very, very important. And as I'm going to show you, these diets just do not stack up very well compared to carbohydrate-rich diets when it comes to maintaining muscle mass, increasing strength, and things of that nature. So before we get started, as I said, this is Always Adaptive Podcast. I hope you'll follow me on all social media. If you just type in Always Adaptive, I should pop right up. And as always, if you do end up liking this podcast on YouTube or wherever you are listening, please consider giving a review. I'm always looking for feedback. If I can improve in any way, I want to do so. Or just drop a like and drop a comment. Let me know what you thought. And I really appreciate that. So with that out of the way, let's move on to the content. Now, this might be a little bit of a different style for some of you. Usually when I talk about topics solo, I talk about several different topics and I don't go super in depth. I might spend 10 to 15, maybe 20 minutes on each topic. But I think for this podcast, we're going to do things a little bit differently. And I'm just going to focus on this one question. And the question is, do diets like the carnivore and ketogenic diet support muscle mass, strength, and power during high intensity exercise? Now, it's important, that high intensity part, because some people will say that there are endurance sports that are high intensity, and that I don't mean high intensity endurance. I mean high intensity as in like a maximal sprint and repeats like that. There's no question. It's not an aerobic activity. Even a maximum VO2 treadmill test is still considered an aerobic event because it's increasing their pace over time. It's like every 2 to 3 minutes or so, they increase the pace. They keep doing that for 8 to 15 minutes. And so at the very end, you could say, yes, that's like very high intensity. But for the beginning 8 to 10, 12 minutes or so, it was pretty lackadaisical, probably a tempo pace for most of that. So VO2 max, for those that aren't familiar with VO2 max, is the volume of oxygen that your body can consume and utilize and spread out to the various different tissues. So that's a really good metric to use to measure your aerobic conditioning. So study number one I want to get into here. This is entitled The Effects of Ketogenic Dieting on Body Composition, Strength, Power, and Hormonal Profiles in Resistance Training Men. This is out of the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. We have 25 participants, so not that many. And again, that's something that's definitely a limitation with, a lot of the research. You're going to have a hard time. I really like this study because they controlled for a lot of different things. And unfortunately, when they do stuff like this, you're not going to find some massive study that has 500 participants or 1,000 participants. It's just not plausible because you're going to overwhelm the researchers. But what you can do, 25 is decent for the amount of things that they controlled for. So 25 resistance trained men, missing women, we need women, duration 10 weeks of either a ketogenic diet or traditional Western diet, followed by 1 week of carbohydrate reintroduction. Now, I want you to remember that point, 1 week of carbohydrate reintroduction. The dietary control, both groups followed an isocaloric and an isonitrogenous diet, meaning they consumed equal amount of calories and an equal amount of protein. And that's extremely important. Whenever you find a study that's measuring performance, but also measuring body composition, they have to control for calories. If they don't, honestly, I throw it out. I don't even look at it. If it doesn't say anything about controlling for calories, and specifically if they're controlling for, if they're measuring lean tissue and they're not controlling for protein, I throw it out there too. So both of those are extremely important, something to look out for when you're looking at a scientific paper that's measuring body composition and stuff like that. Is it isocaloric and isonitrogenous? So they measured body composition, strength, power via the Wingate test, blood lipid profiles, hormonal levels, and blood ketones, just to make sure that they were going into ketosis during the study. Like I said, limitations, small studies, small sample size, 25 participants, short duration, 10 weeks isn't that long, but hey, as you're going to see, it's long enough for some serious strength gains. And it's the population's college age resistance training men. So again, no women, no older adults, no untrained individuals. And this is important. I just had a conversation with Physionic. He's a PhD YouTuber. And I was asking him about things that people that were kind of new to studies, what they could look out for. And one of the things he mentioned was, if you're looking at a study and you're questioning the study for yourself, then make sure the study is actually on the population that relates to you. So like, there's no women in this study, so perhaps women might take this study with a grain of salt. That's an important caveat. There's no older people in this study, so perhaps someone that's 60 years old might also take this with a grain of salt. I'm 37 and I'm a male and I'm trained. So this is relatively close. I'm 15 years probably away from the average age of these individuals, but I'm a little bit older, but I'm still, I'm a trained male. And so this study does kind of apply to me a bit more directly. So training frequency, 3 days a week, training 3 days a week, lower body with squats and leg press, upper body bench press and lat pull down, and then power movements, Olympic lifts. I like that. Olympic lifts are great, cleans, and various assistance exercises as accessories. Okay, so let's go through the findings. So the ketogenic diet, we're going to start with bench press. Now, I'm not sure if these numbers were meant to be in kilograms, because if they are, then these people are ridiculously strong. You're talking about 500 plus pound bench presses. But so they originally put it in kilograms, and I'm going to convert it to pounds for you, just so it makes a bit more sense and you get the totality of what I'm talking about here. So the ketogenic diet group, at the beginning, week 0, the average bench press was 557.1. After week 10, it was 575.8. So they had a 18.7 pound increase in their bench press. Now, I am not including week 11 in this because week 11, as I mentioned in the beginning, week 11 was a carbohydrate introduction week. So there is a massive distinct difference between the ketogenic diet group and the Western diet group for just about all of these numbers that I'm going to tell you about, except for until week 11 when they gave carbohydrates. And I think me telling you that furthers my point that carbohydrates are pretty useful for strength and muscle mass. Now, I'm not saying it has to be exclusive. What I would actually like to see is a hybrid style ketogenic diet where, let's say they're keto and every 4 weeks or so, there's a carbohydrate week. So it's like 4 and 1, 4 and 1. They just keep repeating because as you're going to see here soon, the carbohydrates improved in performance, but also in a very short amount of time, the carbohydrates increased muscle mass in the ketogenic diet group. So that was the keto group. Onto the Western diet group. So the keto group had an 18.7 pound increase. Keep that in mind. The Western diet group, their starting bench press was 548.5. Huge. I mean, I'm not sure if there was a mistake here. At week 0 and then at week 10, it was 580.5. So almost a 600 pound bench press. And as I'm saying this, there's got to be some sort of mistake here because the kilogram numbers actually make more sense. Week 0, 248.8, and week 10, 263.3. But again, we have to just take it how they said it. I'm not going to change it. But anyways, so that is week 10, 580.5. That's a 32 pound increase in their bench press. So almost double what the keto experienced in the 10 weeks. Now let's go on to the squat. So the ketogenic diet group at week 0 had a 633 pound squat. And at week 10, it was 668. Total increase of 34.8 pounds. We'll just say 35 pounds. And then the Western diet group at week 0 had a 598.1 pound squat. And at week 10 had a 658.1 pound squat. So that's a 60 pound difference. Now, I did get in a discussion in Physionics group. He has insiders community that I'm recently a part of now. And I wanted to post a study and see if there were any other studies to refute what I was talking about. And someone got in a discussion with me about this. Now, in the study, you might read that the researchers say both groups increased, and they don't really mention the numbers that I'm talking about here. They say there are no statistically significant differences. It's important for you when you hear that word, those words, there are no statistically significant differences, that you look at it anyway. Don't just hear that and dismiss it, because it's what I gathered from this study is what they were talking about was after 11 weeks, not after 10 weeks. And so after 11 weeks, they've introduced carbohydrates. That completely changes the conditions of the study, right? They're no longer keto. If they're eating carbs, then it's no longer ketogenic diet. And so again, that kind of proves my point. And so what interests me is what happens from week 0 to week 10 when they actually were ketogenic, doing the ketogenic diet, and they were actually in ketosis. That's what's important to me. And so that's what I'm going over here. And so the reason why I say that is because also you have to keep in mind, if you don't really weight train, some of these numbers don't really mean much to you, but I can assure you those people that weight train, the ketogenic diet had a 34.8 pound increase in their squat. The Western diet group had a 60 pound increase in their squat. So it was twice. Whoever does power lift or just strength trains in general, they will tell you that a 60 pound increase in your squat or bench press or anything similar in 10 weeks is massive. That's amazing progress. So to me, that is extremely significant, statistically significant. Even though it doesn't match up with what they were measuring, you still have to dig into the raw data and see. Now let's move on to power. So power is measuring in wattage, and they use the Wingate test, as I said. Now, if you're not familiar with what the Wingate test is, it's a 30-second maximal anaerobic, not aerobic, cycling test used to measure anaerobic power and capacity. So they're looking at how much wattage are they outputting while they're doing this. Usually about a 5-minute warm-up, and then the athletes pedal as fast as possible for 30 seconds. So what did they find? Well, the ketogenic diet group fell flat on their face and actually experienced a decrease in wattage. The week 0 had average of 849.78, and then week 10, 834. So a 15.38 watt decrease in their wattage. The Western diet group had an increase. Week 0 is 828.8, week 10, 904.1. So a 75.3 watt increase. Now, again, after they introduce carbohydrates, all of these numbers get a lot closer to each other. And for some of those groups, the ketogenic actually ketogenic diet actually increases slightly past the Western diet. But again, that means they're not in ketosis because they've now eaten carbohydrates. So that's an important distinction. So let's talk about body composition. Lean body mass. The ketogenic diet from week 0 to week 10 had a plus 2.4% increase in lean body mass. Pretty good. But again, cutting off week 11, I'm going to get to that here in a moment. But the Western diet from week 0 to week 10 had a 4.4% increase in lean body mass. So almost double. Now, interestingly, when they introduced carbohydrates into the mix, week 11, the ketogenic diet's lean body mass increased to 4.8%. Now, is that actually muscle tissue that they put on in a week? They put on an extra 2% of muscle mass, 2.4% of muscle mass in a week? I don't know. You could say that maybe with the carbohydrate, now the muscle that they had all along is, hydrated, because one of your major hydration sources is carbohydrate in your muscle glycogen. It's about 1 gram of glucose to about 3 to 4 grams of water. So major water storage system there. And now they have the carbohydrates week 11. Now their muscles are fuller, but who's to say? So fat mass, ketogenic diet lost 2.2 kilograms, whereas the Western diet only lost 1.5 kilograms. So in favor of the ketogenic diet. No surprises there because the ketogenic diet is great at utilizing fat as a fuel substrate. So most often you will see the ketogenic diet outperform most diets in terms of losing fat, which is cool, And again, like I said, I think keto is great. I think carnivore is great. Just going back to that caveat that I stated earlier. So just to go through some key takeaways here for strength gains, obviously the Western diet outperformed the keto diet in terms of strength gains and by quite a bit, until a carbohydrate refeed week. And then the keto diet was able to bridge the gap. But again, that means they're not in ketosis anymore. So that kind of is null and void. And that's why I made that specific stop at week 10. Power output, the Western diet outperformed keto again, with actually the keto group experiencing a decrease in their power, which to me, power is a marker of health. So if someone's losing power, I don't like that. I don't like that at all. If I have a client and I measure their power output one day in wattage and then it's something and then it goes down 10 weeks from now, there's a problem. That is setting off all kinds of alarm bells in my head, red flags. So that's something to keep in mind. You might not care about those things, but me as a coach, I care about those things tremendously because I do have older clients. So power output is very important to me. So body composition, both groups achieved similar lean mass increases, but the keto group only was able to do that after a carbohydrate refeed. And so that's a pretty big deal. So it's really muscle glycogen dependent. And then fat loss, the ketogenic group had more fat loss, which is no surprise. So that study specifically is in favor of a hybrid style ketogenic diet. As I said, I think that it could be very successful for a lot of people. But carbs are special. And as long as you're using them as a fuel and not as an excess food to just, snack on stuff, then yeah, they could be extremely helpful to especially high performers, people that have a lot of muscle mass, people that strength train a lot. Definitely a good thing to include in your diet. Now, study number 2, just to make sure that I am not being biased here, I wanted to find a study in favor of the ketogenic diet. And this is going to be no surprise to most of you because I already talked about how most people talk about the ketogenic diet in the context of endurance sports. So this study specifically was looking at that. And that is one of the limitations of this study is that they did not measure lean body mass. There was no follow-up on lean body mass. They just took measures of lean body mass in the beginning and they didn't check to see what it was at the end of the study, which to me, that's vital information because regardless of the ketogenic diet performing better in this group or in this study, what if they lost muscle? That's a very valuable metric. So that's another thing you have to look out for when you're looking at performance studies. They're looking at different diets and different protocols on and their effects on performance. Did the participants' body composition change? That's vitally important. The title is Metabolic Characteristics of Keto-Adapted Ultra-Endurance Runners, and the journal is Metabolism, Clinical, and Experimental. They had 20 ultra-endurance athletes, 10 on low carb and 10 on high carbohydrate diet. So again, small sample size. We got to take it with a grain of salt, but these are like very comprehensive studies. So I'm okay with it being small, but we have to keep doing them more and more. But I would love to see for both this study and the study that I already talked about, I would love to see a study like this on the carnivore diet. That's like what we're missing. And from what I could find, there aren't even any like newly registered trials where people are looking at this type of stuff. But anyway, so dietary habits, we have the low carb group, keto adapted for 20 months on average, 70% fat, primarily saturated and monounsaturated fat, 10% carbohydrate, 19% protein. High carb group, 59% carbs, 25% fat, 14% protein. A little low on the protein. The purpose of the study was to determine how long-term keto adaptation affects fat and carbohydrate oxidation during endurance exercises, muscle glycogen use and resynthesis, and metabolic markers, ketones, insulin, lactate, triglycerides. So the tests that they used were a maximal graded treadmill test, testing the VO2 max, and they measured gas exchange and maximal fat oxidation rate. The low carb group had a 2.3 times higher fat oxidation and burned fat at a higher intensity. No surprise there. They're in ketosis. Then they also did a 3-hour sub-maximal run, 65% of VO2 max. They measured gas exchange and relative perceived exertion. Low carb used 88% for fat versus 56% fat for the high carb group, and performance was similar. Muscle biopsy, where they measured muscle glycogen, both groups had similar glycogen depletion and resynthesis. That's actually pretty cool. You would think that glycogen depletion would be a little bit lower on the keto group, but the fact that it was still depleting, actually, it kind of raises some questions. But anyways, blood metabolites, ketones, insulin, glucose, and lactate. Low carb diet had higher ketones, obviously. Lactate increased later in exercise. So just to dig into the first two tests they did, the VO2 max test, the maximal graded exercise test. So that's when they run on a treadmill, and every 1 to 3 minutes, it increases speed or incline until exhaustion. Now, the typical test lasted 8 to 15 minutes. So again, that is an aerobic event. That is not a super, yes, you will be using your anaerobic system during that, particularly at the tail end of it. But for the most part, that is an aerobic event. So that is not measuring quote unquote high intensity stuff through the lens that I'm viewing it through. So that Wingate test, to me, that is more akin to a maximal power output, high intensity effort. But the takeaway there is the keto adapted athletes burn fat at significantly higher rates, even at higher exercise intensities. However, VO2 max itself was similar between groups, meaning overall aerobic capacity was not impaired by long-term keto adaptation. Great. But we also have to say that aerobic capacity was not impaired by carbohydrates either. Now, everyone would say, oh, well, no duh, Randall, everyone uses carbs when they're doing long endurance style events. Yes. And so let's not make this the argument that keto is better or carbs are better. They're just different strategies. If you find that your symptoms of whatever improve on a high fat ketogenic diet, low carb ketogenic diet, fantastic. Now you know that you can have success in long effort, high intensity effort, endurance sports. But you can also do that with carbohydrates. So it's not that one is better than the other. They both perform about the same. And there's other studies out there that would say that. 3-hour submaximal run protocol was the other test. Again, 65% of VO2 max. Athletes ran at about 64 to 65% of VO2 max for 3 hours on a treadmill. That's a long effort. The low carb group relied on fat for 88% of energy, while the high carb group only used about 56% fat. Despite drastically different fuel utilization, performance and perceived exertion were similar between groups. Again, no one group was better. Now, study limitations, and this is important. No follow-up measures for lean mass. That's exactly what I talked about at the beginning. No max effort performance test. That's the sprints. That's the Wingate test that I was talking about. And that means that the study does not show how keto affects strength or power-based performance. Finally, we have study 3. And this study is going to show a decrease in lean tissue for the ketogenic diet. So this study is entitled "A Low Carbohydrate Ketogenic Diet Reduces Body Mass Without Compromising Performance in Powerlifting and Olympic Weightlifting Athletes." So it's in the title, "Without Compromising Performance in Powerlifting and Olympic Weightlifting Athletes." While that's important, again, body composition is also important. So yes, they maintain their performance, but they lost lean body mass. So let's get into it. Randomized crossover trial, 14 strength athletes, 8 males, 6 females. We've got some females, there we go, competing in powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting. Each participant completed both diet phases. So you have, for 3 months, they do the low carb ketogenic diet. And then for 3 months, they do the usual diet phase. And then they cross over and both of them do the other diet. Dietary intervention, low carb ketogenic diet phase, 70% fat, 25% protein, 5% carbs. Usual diet phase, around 250 grams a day of carbs, similar protein intake to low carb ketogenic diet. Calorie intake remained constant between diets, isocaloric, which is great. I would like to have seen that be isonitrogenous, like the first study I talked about. But hey, no one's perfect. These studies aren't always going to be perfect. We just take what we can. Measurements taken, body composition, very important. Strength and performance, very important. Metabolic markers, so great. All right, so let's talk about body composition first. We have body mass, baseline, 77.9 kilograms. Usual diet goes up to 79.4, increase from baseline. Low carb ketogenic diet, 76, a decrease from baseline. So, okay, decrease in body weight from the low carb ketogenic diet, check. Fat mass, usual diet had an increase from baseline from 13.7% to 14.7%. That's a pretty notable increase in fat mass, not good. And the low carb ketogenic diet went from 13.7% to no change. So they remain constant. Lean mass, we have baseline 61.1 kilograms of lean body mass at baseline. The usual diet maintained and got a slight increase, so 61.5 kilograms increase from baseline, whereas the low carb ketogenic diet actually experienced a decrease. So going to 59.3, so almost 2 kilograms there, which is about 4 pounds, almost over 4 pounds of lean mass loss there. Now, again, the caveat there is that from lack of hydration? So ketogenic diets, because they don't have very many carbohydrates, their muscle has a hard time holding on to water. But that being said, that also creates an environment that's not conducive to muscle maintenance or muscle building in the first place. If you have a environment that's chronically dehydrated, you're not supporting that musculature. And the harder you work while you're in that environment, the greater the likelihood that you will actually get rid of that muscle mass. So that's very important. Strength performance. So 1 rep max in strength, and this is in kilograms. So baseline was 132 kilograms and went up to 137 kilograms in the usual diet, and then went up to 135 in the low carb ketogenic diet. So both increased, but the usual diet increased more. And that's not surprising to me based off of the first study that we talked about. So lastly, I want to talk about the carnivore diet, and then I'll give you kind of my closing thoughts on this whole thing. Now, again, there is not very much research out there about the carnivore diet. And what I could find was very poor. So I'm going to talk about a meta-analysis, and let me just say out of the gate that this is a very poor meta-analysis. It's only 3 studies, so that's a major limitation. And the total participants across all of the studies is 60. So that's not a good sample size, especially for a meta-analysis. You would expect that in just one study alone. Now, let's go through it. So this study is called The Effect of the Carnivore Diet Under Calorie Restriction on Body Composition Changes in Athletes, a Systematic Meta-Analysis. Publication date is 2024. So this is preprint, but hopefully this is science to come. Now, they did say in the study, we compared this diet's effects on body fat reduction, muscle mass retention, and weight loss with other calorie-restricted diets. That's important because I did not see any other calorie-restricted diets that they compared it to. So there was no comparison group. Maybe I missed something, but I got the actual PDF of the study, and yeah, I mean, I couldn't find that data anywhere. It was just showing the carnivore diet's statistics. So they looked at fat loss percentage, muscle mass change, and total weight loss in kilograms. So the key findings are study 1, which had 25 participants, had a fat loss of 3.8% with no muscle mass change, which good. Duration 8 weeks. Study 2, 20 participants, 4.2% fat loss, but also experienced a slight muscle mass loss of 0.6%. And that was 6 weeks duration, very short study, very short intervention. And then study 3, 15 participants, 3.2% fat loss, and again, a muscle mass change of negative 0.4. So they lost 0.4%. Now, that might not sound like that much, but again, this is why we need comparison. We need to see, okay, this is what happens to the carnivore diet. What happens to, let's say they were comparing the carnivore diet to a low carb ketogenic diet, and then also they had a usual diet or Western diet or any Mediterranean diet, something to compare it to, because we don't know, without something to compare it to, what does that muscle mass change even mean? And regardless, when people lose weight, it's very likely they're going to lose a little bit of muscle. It's incredibly hard unless you are doing things perfectly. You're a very experienced athlete who's been in bodybuilding for a long time. It's very hard to lose, let's say, 10 pounds of weight without maybe 1 pound of that being muscle or 1.5 pounds. It's very difficult. The other limitation of this was that this was all self-reported diet adherence, meaning they weren't providing the food. It wasn't isocaloric. It wasn't isonitrogenous, which all of those things are extremely important as well. So it's very hard to confirm those results as well. Now, what are my closing thoughts on this? Well, first, let me just provide sort of a mechanism of why I don't really go for a ketogenic diet when it comes to high intensity, like maximal power output, maximal strength output, and then also preserving muscle mass and building muscle. Gluconeogenesis is why. So when your heart rate reaches a certain level, your body will shift gears. You could think of it as you're going to shift from different energy systems. You have your phosphocreatine system, you have your glycolytic energy system, and you have your phosphorylative oxidative, fat oxidative pathway as well. And all of those kind of go at different speeds, where fat oxidation is a sort of slower process. Glycolysis is very fast. I mean, it happens in seconds. And gluconeogenesis can take minutes to hours, because what it's doing, gluconeogenesis, for those that are not familiar, is your body converting amino acids to glucose. And that costs a lot of energy. First and foremost, it requires 6 ATP molecules, but it's also not very time efficient. So when you have a situation like a Wingate power test where it only lasts 30 seconds and you're pushing as hard as you can, no way gluconeogenesis can keep up with that. And so you will see a power drop with that. Also, you have to think about, okay, where are the amino acids coming from? Now, say something like an endurance event, a marathon, let's say someone is doing carnivore. Well, your pool of amino acids will eventually run out. Your body can only hold so much. And so much like during a carb-fed athlete who is constantly doing running gels, you have to constantly supply the amino acids as well. And so if you eat, let's say, a steak or some chicken or whatever it is that you're going to eat as a carnivore athlete, you eat that beforehand, how are you going to continue to get more amino acids in your body? You're going to eat meat while you're sloshing around out there on the trail or whatever? That's not a very good idea. You might get nauseous from doing that, some real serious gastric distress. So the only alternative there is that your body will start to look towards your own muscle, breaking down your muscle to create glucose. And obviously, there's also ketones that your body is utilizing as fuel, but it's also using glucose. As we saw earlier, the rates of glycogen emptying and resynthesis were the same among the keto group and the usual diet group in study 2, I believe it was. So that means even the keto group was still emptying glycogen stores for fuel. Now, if you're not replenishing that stuff, your body will break down your muscle via gluconeogenesis. So I would say, while it's pretty awesome that we have this system in gluconeogenesis, it's slow and it's costly. It's a backup system. It's not supposed to be your primary system. Ketones, you could say you could use that as your primary system. But again, fat oxidation also cannot keep up with the same speed of ATP production as glycolysis can. So in closing, I just want to say again, for the third time, I think ketogenic diets and carnivore diets can be really great for some people, but I think viewing things through the lens of longevity and health, I think we are better off going through hybrid styles of these diets to not just focus on performance, but focusing on maximal power output, maximal strength output, preserving lean tissue and building lean tissue. Those things are incredibly important to me. And from what I've seen with these studies, along with other studies that I've read, and please, if you know of a study that refutes what I'm saying, put it in the comments, because that is what would really change my mind. Again, this isn't a hill that I'm willing to die on. But that being said, you just type in the comments, oh, well, this athlete's carnivore and they're having great success. Oh, well, this athlete's keto and they're having great success. Okay, well, 90% of the athletes in the world are on carbohydrate-rich diets. So that point is null and void. What I'm looking for is actual research, randomized controlled trials that are isocaloric, isonitrogenous, controlling for protein, and that are showing that there is not a muscle mass loss, lean tissue loss, showing that there is not a power loss, and showing that there is not a strength loss. And the one thing I'll leave you with is, as I mentioned in the beginning, just because the researcher says it's not statistically significant does not mean that it's not significant. as I showed you, it is significant regardless of what they say. So I think a good strategy is the 4-in-1 ratio that I was saying earlier. 4 weeks on keto, 1 week introducing carbs, switching back to keto for 4 weeks, and rinse and repeat. I think that's a really good strategy to help preserve your lean muscle mass while also being fat adapted and being really great at using ketones for fuel. But anyways, that's it for the episode. This was a little bit of a different style, just focusing on one topic and doing a deeper dive on it, as opposed to talking briefly about several different topics. But let me know what you thought about this. If you like this style, then yeah, please let me know. I'm willing to do this. I actually like doing deep dives. I just, I fear of not providing enough content per episode. But yeah, if it works for y'all, then it works for me. But this is the Always Adaptive podcast. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you got a lot of value from this. If you know anyone that's doing the keto diet or the carnivore diet and they're like a high performer, send them this podcast, share it with people you think might get some benefit from it. But yeah, I release podcasts every Tuesday at midnight, and I hope you'll follow me on social media. If you just type in Always Adaptive on all social media, I should pop right up there. But if you like the podcast, leave a like, subscribe. Hit that notification bell on YouTube if you're there, leave a review, all of that. I really appreciate you, but I will see you at the next one.